All right, so I'll get started here. Yeah,
Welcome,
so
everybody.
hey everybody, thanks for listening.
Yeah,
Glad you're still with us.
absolutely. Trying to upgrade our. Oh, got a little bit of a roof show
Yeah,
on.
if you're watching our video stream, you can see that I stopped hand holding my microphone and I upgraded to a little microphone arm here, and then you can
Yeah.
see that Paul decided to one up me and go to this super professional, nice looking setup.
Yeah.
So I thought I
try
was
hard.
improving, and then he just went and left me in the dust like a true friend.
Yep. And Brandon's very accepting because he's a good friend. He's not bitter at all.
No, yes, no bitterness. No, none.
Zero. Nice.
Yeah, dude. So I want to talk about a little bit of my vacation that I just went on this past week with my wife down to Belize, which was fun.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
One of the key aspects about it that I thought was really inspiring. I want to focus mostly on the Mayan culture which is really fun. And I know that we've both looked into Mayan archaeology through, Graham Hancock and different things. But it's pretty cool because it's very located in the Yucatan Peninsula, which is a little bit of Mexico and like Guatemala and Nicaragua and Belize right there on the edge. But it's just like the epicenter of all of the Mayan temples and ruins and all their sites. And it was really cool. Definitely, I think, the highlight of the trip for us to go on a tour where we had a tour guide for all day. And we just went to, at least with the tour guide, we went to one specific ruin that I'm going to try to say the name of. I think it's called Zunantunich, but it's spelled with an X.
I was about to say, yeah.
Yeah, so you want to be like, yeah, you want to be like Xunantunich. How do I say that? But the whole trip I was practicing, so hopefully I'm saying it correctly now. But we went to there, and we went to another place that was called Cahal Pech, and that's another funny spelling because Pech is spelled Pech, so it's like Petch, but it's like Peck. Anyway, it's kind of a weird thing. But yeah, going to both those places and climbing a lot of stairs, and it was pretty cool just ducking through all the doorways, going into all the weird little rooms, just so much
This is where they
detail.
sacrifice the children.
Yeah, I know. It's okay, where was the sacrifice altar? Okay, time to go lay down on this. I don't know. I didn't see
20,000 skulls piled up on the staircase. Yeah.
Where's the skull scene from Lord of the Rings when they're running out of the dead men cave and all the skulls fall
So were
down
these like
the
pyramids or just like lived in towns and rooms or?
These were like pyramids, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. These two places, I mean, they sat on top of different hills, and there were a bunch of places like this all over in Belize, but these were just the two that we happened to go to. And it's pretty cool. They kind of had like a main center temple and then like some sort of sub temples around them. And some of them weren't even temples. They were like living quarters. It was like the palace that people lived in. In the case of Zunantunich, it was the palace that the Spaniards later called El Castillo. And it was really interesting because it was very symbolic. In the Mayan culture, they have this religious worldview where they think of the world in all these different levels. And they think that there's 13 levels of like basically heaven, where there's like 13 gods. And then there's like 9 levels of hell, which they call Xibalba, which is kind of a fun word to say. And any caves, and there's a lot of big caves around Belize, any big caves they thought were like the doorways to Xibalba. And so they did a lot of sacrifices at the caves, or then they would go to these temples, and they would do sacrifices, and the temples were like up on these hills, and they were like, high, reaching up towards the sky, like it's going up to heaven. And at Zunantunich, the one big palace that was there, called El Castillo, actually had 13 levels to it. So it was almost like you're ascending the 13 levels of going up to heaven, which is pretty interesting. And they had lots of cool...
I didn't know they were Catholic.
The purgatory.
Yeah, turns out the Mayans were Catholic all along.
Except the Pope is like, you must die now. So yeah, it was cool just seeing their structures, the way they designed it, where the stairs are so steep, right? And you see that depicted in like films and whatnot. And when you climb those steps, the idea is that it's so steep. Not only is it good for defending against invaders, but it's also good because it's sort of this reverence of climbing the steps, because it's so steep. You have to crawl kind of with your hands in order to make sure you don't fall backwards. So it's kind of like you're crawling hands and feet in reverence to the gods. You know, it's kind of
like a Jacob's ladder type thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, it was really cool having that experience, seeing the architecture, the beautiful right angles that they created in their stonework, just the designs on carvings and faces on the stones. Learning
I'm the
about
jealous
their
one,
culture. Dude, you would have loved it. You would have totally thought it was great. It was just right out of Graham Hancock. It was like I could be in one of his books right now. It was pretty neat. Yeah.
Yeah. Did they have any of like the acoustic stuff? I know like in some pyramids in Mexico, when you like, for instance, like clap at the bottom, you can hear it like behind you or.
Yeah. Our tour guide had us do that. Yeah. Cause there was a big court room basically where there was the El Castillo on one end, and then there was surrounded by a bunch of different temples all around. And in the middle was a central temple in the middle of this big courtyard. And he had us climb up on the middle temple and clap our hands. And you could just hear it echo in the whole off of all the buildings, you know, in a circle, which was pretty cool.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. So,
what kind of stone was it? I'm always curious. Is it like a granite type stone or?
I want to say it was it limestone? No, I don't know if it was limestone. I can't remember what the type of the stone was. Good question. Yeah.
I'm sure it's one of those harder stones, but yeah, it has to be to kind of last that long.
Yeah. I know that it was quarried like a couple miles away, and then they brought it over. And it wasn't those big, not as many of those big central stones that you find like in the pyramids where it's like one gigantic stone that weighs like several tons. It was a lot of smaller stones that were kind of put together with grout and different things in between. So, you know, they could have probably carried it over by hand. Sure. But I don't think that the Maya had carts, because it's said that the Maya maybe didn't have wheels. And there's some controversy about that. Some people think that they may have found a couple wheels, and so maybe the Maya did use wheels, but it's not a very abundant thing that they have found in the digs. So, theoretically, instead of using like a horse-drawn cart to like package all of your stones from one place to another, they might have like carried it by hand, which is kind of crazy.
Or levitated it, if you believe Joe Rogan.
Yeah, or they did some shrooms and levitated the stones across the sky.
Right? Yeah, that's so cool, man. So what was the tour guide's thing? Was he just kind of like an expert on the area, or did he? I mean, I'm sure was he like a history buff or something?
He was a history buff. Yeah, dude, we lucked out on a great tour guide. He had been doing the tours there for like 10 years, and he just knew so much stuff about history and the philosophy and every weird little detail about each little site that we went to. It was really cool. And he kept having these kind of like the deeper meaning of it, you know, and he talked about how the Mayan culture fell from its glory because there was kind of the separation of classes. There was kind of the elite class and then like the peasantry class, which again sounded very much like the Catholic Church to me. But the elite class, they understood the seasons, they understood mathematics, and they had special schools where the wealthy would send their kids and they would go serve in the temples, and they knew how to do architecture and design massive buildings and all this stuff. And then the rest of the people were kind of the little peons that sort of did what they said. And they always sort of brought all this mystical knowledge they had, which today is just education, you know. They sort of brought it all back to the religious beliefs and back to the gods, and how, the peasants have to serve us because we're like the intelligent people who know the will of the gods. And it eventually fell apart because later on in their civilization, they were starting to predict weather patterns and saying, okay, everybody bring your sacrifices so that the rain god will bless us with rain for our crops. And in these months, there's going to be rain, which they just had been tracking the stars and had records of when the rainy seasons were. Mm-hmm. But then eventually it started heating up. There weren't rain as predictably, after several years. It doesn't seem like there's as much rain. Our crops are kind of dying. We did the sacrifices to the gods. What's the deal? And so people started questioning the hierarchy and kind of disbelieving in the gods and the elites, and started moving away from the big central towns and saying, forget these guys. We're going to go live on our own in our own places and do our own thing.
And then they moved to Idaho.
And and then they moved up to the Aztecs and got sacrificed. I don't know.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So were the Mayans dead before, I guess Western people came and introduced a bunch of diseases and stuff? Or
I don't know. I think that they might have collapsed before the Spanish came, or at least been very small population. Mm-hmm. I do know, I think that they were still around, but just in very reduced numbers. I think when the Spanish came, it was mostly the Aztec nation that was in its prime.
I see.
And they were the nation that was like, hey, we want to offer a bunch of sacrifices. Here's a little village over here. Let's just genocide this whole village and sacrifice them. All right,
Yeah.
So they were pretty crazy about that. But I think the Spanish did come because there were a few things that they learned from the Maya that apparently weren't popular back in Europe before they came to the Maya. One of those was the number 0. The Maya were so sophisticated in their math that they counted into the negatives, and they would count from 0 and understood mathematics in that way. Apparently, Europeans mostly thought of math in a positive sense. So 1 + 1 = 2. And that was the only way that they thought of mathematics,
Yeah.
So I
can't
guess
have nothing.
You can't have nothing. What does that mean? They hadn't really thought of that type of math before. And the Maya introduced that to them. So that's kind of interesting to think about. And I think they also introduced cocoa beans to them as well, like cacao and chocolate. So apparently chocolate wasn't maybe as popular in Europe until the Spanish came to the Maya and were like, oh, you guys eat chocolate? Cool. We want chocolate too.
Yeah.
So
look at it now. Huh.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing by your raving review, you would recommend anyone go to Belize?
Oh yeah. I would definitely recommend going to Belize. I would definitely recommend checking out the Mayan ruins. Super, super cool. Be careful going up and down those stairs. There definitely felt like it would not be hard. There's some railing that modern tour guides put in today, but otherwise you get to the top of this 13-story building looking over the edge, and it's there's nothing.
Get a handhold if you're lucky.
Falling over. Yeah. You're just going to fall down some very steep stairs.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting.
So, yeah. No, it was cool.
So is there any other things to do there that you would recommend? Windsurfing?
We didn't do any windsurfing. No turtle hunting. No, we did some great snorkeling. The other interesting thing with Belize, just as a country in general, is the caves, which are really cool. And then they've got a bunch of islands and a Great Barrier Reef, which actually it's the second largest barrier reef next to the one in Australia, which apparently the one in Australia is dying off. A lot of the coral is kind of decaying.
I've heard that.
So I think pretty soon the one in Belize is, if it hasn't already surpassed it, is going to be the main barrier reef of the world.
Wow.
Which I got to say, with snorkeling the barrier reef with my wife, and again, we went out with a group of people on a boat and hit a bunch of hot spots. There was a lot of life out there. Nurse sharks that we swam with, and
so cool.
Stingrays in the water that were swimming around, and all kinds of cool coral and seaweed that we saw, and tons of weird little fish. Saw an eel that was hiding away in a little cove. Yeah, it was super cool.
Are they trying to preserve that for their country? Is there
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. They're everything that we did with them was pretty Like they didn't do anything crazy, you know. It wasn't like go down there and grab a shell and stick it in your pocket and bring it back. You know what I mean? It wasn't like that. It was
It's like don't get your microbes all over a coral.
yeah.
Son.
It was based. Yeah, they were like, don't touch anything, just look. You know?
Yeah, that's cool.
But yeah.
Want to keep it around for future generations.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean that's cool, and we did that. And I think the other thing that was cool, just back on the Mayan theme, was the caves. The same tour guide who took us to the Mayan ruins took us to a cave. And like I was saying earlier, the Maya thought that caves were like Xibalba. It was like the entryway to hell. And it was pretty crazy. We did like a tube ride through this cave. So the cave was so big and it had a giant river basically going through the cave. And the cave was like
inner tubing.
Yeah, like inner tubing,
I see.
tubing through the cave.
Wow.
Yeah, so we just hopped on some tubes and floated from one end to the other of a cave.
That's
and I
cool.
don't know, it was maybe like a mile plus. No, it was maybe like a couple miles of just like floating through this cave.
Couple miles?
And it was huge.
That'll take like half an hour.
Oh, it took us probably like 3 hours going through that cave.
What?
Yeah. No, we took a long time going through the cave.
What?
We were in that cave for a long time.
I think you're kind of claustrophobic.
I mean, it was a big cave. You were in like a cathedral of a cave. It was huge. Yeah. Like you weren't close to you couldn't even like touch the walls unless you swam over and like went to them.
Yeah. But just to be underground for that long, I guess even.
Like, no matter how big it is. Yeah. It was, like there was like we all had headlamps on. And so we could like look at all the stuff on the walls and cool things. But there was a moment when our tour guide said, okay, turn off your headlamps and just like be in the dark. And he was just talking to us in the dark for a little bit. I was like, okay, this is when the cave monster comes out and eats us.
Yeah, I'm glad cave guides do that. I've been in a cave where they did that before. And it was like, I think we even talked about it in one of our episodes where, you know, I think you like go blind after like, it's like 3 days without light.
Oh, yeah.
It's insane. Yeah. But yeah, your brain just starts like making stuff up to see because it won't like is missing the sensory input.
Yeah, it's crazy.
They experience true dark. Then it's cool.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. And swam in the water, jumped off some rocks in the cave to jump into a big cave pool that we swim around in.
Probably all like warm and stuff, huh?
I mean, the whole country was warm, so yeah, it was pretty warm out in there. You know, I mean, just in our normal bathing suits. You know, no trouble swimming in it or anything.
Can't even imagine that being here in the snow and ice.
Yeah, dude, it was hot down there, like too hot. Like I got sunburned. Yeah.
Oh geez, first day.
Oh, yeah. No, on the snorkeling, because that was all day out on a boat and then in the water and I didn't realize how white and pale I've been hiding in the winter of North Idaho for several months.
All the little kids of Belize were like, "What's that?"
Yeah,
that's a white man, honey.
That's
very white man. Yeah. Dang.
Yeah.
Cool.
No. Yeah. So yeah, and the caves were cool, and it's interesting going in there. The Maya would go into the cave, and they thought that the deeper they were going into the cave, the deeper they were going into hell, which is interesting, into Xibalba.
Yeah.
And so they would bring these pots, these like clay pots with like some kind of offering in there, and they would go into the cave, find solid land somewhere, and then they would take the pots and they would smash the pots. And there was something about like smashing the pots that you're now exposing the fruits that you brought, or the organs of animals, or whatever the thing is that you're going to sacrifice and offer, and you smash the pots, and it's like making it available to the gods of Xibalba.
Interesting.
And so there was like some pottery shards that we looked at one moment. That was kind of interesting.
I know, a lot of cultures like kind of saw caves that way. I think even like a lot of the Greek myths and stuff, it's always like, the heroic character, whatever, finds himself outside a cave and then, goes down and meets Hades and does whatever he needs to do. Actually even Lost, that show Lost, they had their like big, I don't know, there was like whatever the heart of the island ended up being. It was like in a cave, kind of like that.
Oh, interesting.
Like this kind of essence of things, but
yeah.
Did I cut you off? Or you?
No,
something else about that?
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was, that was the Maya culture. It's a big part of Belize, and obviously we did other stuff when we were down there. But I think if you have a chance, anybody listening, you have a chance to go down to Belize and check out the Mayan ruins. It's very inspiring. And my question that I have for you, Paul, is, it was kind of funny when my wife and I were down in Belize at one point at the Airbnb that we were staying in. We were like, oh, let's watch a movie. What should we watch? And we thought, well, we got to watch 2012 about the Mayan calendar, the end of the world.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting after like being at the temples and hearing about how they believed in this calendar system and it was going to end and the world kind of went through these cycles. My question for you is, do you feel like there's any truth to the idea of the Mayan calendar? Do you feel like they got that wrong, or do you feel like there's something true that maybe they got right with the Mayan calendar? What do you think about that?
Yeah. I do think there is something true. I think with things like that, where it's predicting something on such a large scale that it's hard to really, I guess, maybe understand what the full implications of like what the prediction is, like people obviously look towards like end of the world or something, but like, what does that even mean really at the end of the day? You could have, it could be something like there could be, I'm trying to find a good way to word this, but there could be like a big shift in some epoch of history happening, whether like scientific or cultural, that we wouldn't even like necessarily pick up on until, hundreds of years later or whatever, when it started to manifest itself. Like I always think of, people who lived in Rome, it's like, you would have never thought Rome was going to fail or fall. But like at some point there was a turning point, like where things were, on the decline or there was a series of chain events that was going to lead to like, Rome getting sacked or something,
Right.
So something was set in motion at that point in time. And so I think with the calendar type thing, it could be something along those lines where either some sort of like spiritual thing shifts in the world or some sort of metaphysical or even physical. Like it could be, like the poles shifting or something, like that's what it could be predicting. And like the poles have shifted before. And so like that could be what was being measured or something. And like, you wouldn't even necessarily know. I mean, with something like that, you would know right away, but I'm speaking more maybe to like something like that we couldn't measure yet, that was like switching or something like that. So
that's a good point. Yeah. Maybe something happened that we wouldn't even have the capacity to be aware of. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there is something to it because people, it's so ahead of its time and kind of like prescient is I think the word, like that, like, and things that don't have value rarely survive from what I understand. So it's like, the things that are important are the things that get passed down or protected or cared about or remembered. And so things like, no one's ever going to remember what the king of the Mayans had for breakfast on a Tuesday, 3,000 years later. It's like just not going to happen. But, or, likewise, something that happens here that's not really relevant isn't going to get passed down at all. But things that have merit, even if they're, not necessarily like true in the truest sense, like take like a myth, for example, like it's not necessarily even that it happened, but something in there was true and worth remembering and so got passed down. So I think there is some inherent value that it did get passed down for as long as it did. So
yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to think about it growing up in a culture where they had like an official date for the end of the world. Like what if you lived in like from the moment you were born, your parents teach you, yeah, and in like 1,000 years from now, the world is going to end. So we'll pass away by then, but like it's eventually going to all it's going to end for somebody in like 1,000 years, you know? So we're just trying to like prepare for that. We're going to sacrifice some stuff to maybe delay it a little bit longer. Like,
Yeah.
oh, okay. That's
Well,
interesting.
I don't know that it's like even, I don't think it's the end of the world necessarily. I think it ties a lot to the astrological stuff where there's like cycles. So it's just the end of one cycle, which, I mean, I think a lot of people, when they put it in like a headline, it comes out as end of the world. But more realistically, it's the end of a age or like the end of a cycle. So I think
That's
it's
a good
like
way of thinking about it. Yeah.
I think it's like the end of like a 24,000 year cycle or something like that.
Yeah. It's probably the beginning of the AI cycle.
Well, that's again, maybe. That's kind of what I think. It's like, you know, the world maybe didn't end, but you know, maybe that was, again, like a new era of intelligence or something in the universe, like through AI. Who knows? Like, I don't know, maybe someone published like an AI paper that led to GPT 3 in 2012, and this was like the seminal paper that they needed to like set the course rolling for artificial intelligence. Who knows? Yeah. It's just I could definitely see something like that happen, because when you look back through history, you can definitely see like chunks, and even people kind of like, I don't know if people subconsciously pick up on that, or if they, for whatever, or if that's just what people do is categorize things, but you can like see that people put things in chunks throughout history, you know, like this is the Dark Ages, this was the Bronze Age, this was the, you know, and so you're like distilling millions of events down to like a sentence or like a categorization. Yeah. And so I don't know that those things exist, or if that's just something that like people like put on the past and just so it can be packaged cleanly and talked about neatly. But yeah, I don't know. What do you think about it?
Well, and you know, that's an interesting point, because if you think about like the Dark Ages, it's like, were the Dark Ages dark for everyone on planet Earth or just the European culture? You know, just whoever's history books we've spent the most time reading, like, and what actually made the Dark Ages dark? You know, was it actually that the sky was blotted out and you couldn't see, or people just had a bad time, a lot of bad circumstances?
I think there was a volcano at that point in time somewhere in the world.
I think actually there was, yeah.
And so I think probably literally and figuratively.
I think there was a volcano. I think maybe there was the plague. I think civilization like regressed from sort of the glory of the Greco-Roman era. Instead of people creating all these like beautiful artistic creations and civilization being very unified, I think things fell apart a little bit, and a lot of nations were kind of in survival mode a little bit more.
Yeah, and it's funny because it depends who you ask too, because even like in the Orthodox tradition and stuff, people, if you ever want to go a deep dive, go look into like their views on the Renaissance and all that kind of stuff, and Martin Luther. But you know, for them, they saw that as actually kind of like almost a high point or something. It was like, you know, all these like Gothic cathedrals and stuff were being built. And so it's like, which in itself is kind of a wonder. But yeah, so it's like they see that era as like, you know, all the monasteries flourishing and kind of like, you know, traditional orthodoxy taking hold and like spreading and stuff. So it is interesting to see, like different take on just what the colloquial term is for that age.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense that would be the golden era with all those Belgian monasteries making Belgian beers, you know, makes sense to me.
People are living the good life, simpler times.
Just living up in my mountains, drinking my beer. My little garden.
Yeah.
Hefeweizen. I like Hefeweizen.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. The only
that's my
astounding thing I know.
Yeah. That's my inspiring thing for the peoples. Go research the Mayan culture, visit a ruin, sacrifice something, think about the end of the world. Maybe don't sacrifice it.
Throw my cell phone off this pyramid.
Oh, you know what? Actually,
goodbye, Zuckerberg.
There's actually one more funny thing I should say about the Mayans and sacrifice that I just now thought of. Yeah. Apparently, the Mayans were the first people to create a team sport. Apparently, a lot of sports back in the day was individual. It was the hoop ball game. Yeah, they've depicted it in movies and stuff where you like hit the ball with your hips and your shoulders and elbows. You can't use your like hands or your feet. So it's like very different from the sports that we have today. And I can't remember what it was called. It was like
probably like Jaguar ball or something.
It's like pip to talk, pip pop. What was it? Pop to talk, pop to talk, pop to pop. Pop to pop. That's what it is. My wife's sitting on the couch and she's listening.
Nice. That was my second guess after Jaguar ball. Just by the way.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And that was another thing with the Mayas. They were super obsessed with Jaguars. But yeah. So they played this game, and most of the time when they played this game, it was just for fun and practice, and people were into the game. But every once in a while, they would hold like the grand tournament of the game. And when they did, the winners of the game would get sacrificed, which is a weird thing. It's like you almost think of the sacrifice as a punishment, but in the Mayan culture, they saw sacrifice as if you are being sacrificed for the gods, then you, in this like glorious way of being the champions of this game. And they kind of looked at the game as though the game was like kind of this spiritual thing as well. There was something about the game that was like approved by the gods. Yeah. So if you won, then you were like chosen by the gods, and you basically would get sacrificed, and it was an honor. And it meant that in the afterlife, you could skip all of the 9 levels of hell. You wouldn't go through this purgatory system that everybody has to go through when they die. Instead, you earned your way like straight to heaven. And so, yeah, there was kind of a weird thing with people wanting to play that game and be good at it. So that's interesting.
Yeah. I'd be like, oops, I dropped the ball again. I hope nobody from the enemy team picks it up and scores. That'd be a real shame.
I'd really like you to have the ball, because I just really want you to be blessed. Yes.
Yeah.
I want you to stop being my neighbor.
Yeah. Your Jaguar's a little too loud. Keeping me up. Yeah, okay. Cool.
Anyway, nice. That's my fun Mayan stuff. I'll conclude with that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. All right, so I guess we'll move to my topic.
Yeah, man. I got What's inspired you this week?
I got another meta one. I got podcasting.
Oh, okay. I didn't see that coming.
Right? Yeah, no, I just I think about like how much podcasts have changed, you know, my experience of the world, my base of knowledge, you know, how I live my life on a daily basis. It's like, it's kind of a lot of impact for just a new form of media, essentially. Because like, I don't think people have really seen it as that for a long time. It's always just kind of been like, oh, you know, podcasting, that's like a hobby people do or whatever, you know? Whereas like you think of like TV and you're like, that's entertainment, or that's, you know, it's a very defined medium. So yeah, it's like kind of interesting where, you know, we have this new medium that people didn't even recognize as one for a while, but I think people are starting to realize like it's just kind of a thing to stay, you know, as far as how people like consume information, or, you know, I'm sure it is even taking the place of reading for a lot of people. But yeah, so I was kind of like, wanted to hear your thoughts too of like, I mean, do you think podcasting is here to stay for one, and do you think it's like disruptive or going to like change the way everybody lives in the future or currently?
Well, yeah, I think it has really disrupted the I think it's really disrupted like the transfer of information, because for a long time, I mean, just pre-social media era, maybe that's what changed in 2012. Pre-social media era, you had all these people who were, you know, these famous people or celebrities or the author of a book or the professor at this college or whatever it is. And unless you like knew that person in person, it was very difficult to interact with them. You know, you could maybe like write them a letter and they would reply. I mean, for most of history, if there is somebody who's a public figure, you can't necessarily like sit down and enjoy conversation with them. But now we get to see their Facebook profile and their Instagram photos, and they've done interviews with different people and all this stuff. And they might go on to some long form podcast where they just talk about whatever they want to talk about, or maybe they have their own podcast. And so you're like regularly getting the insights to this person's life and what they think in their mind, and it's being recorded. And I think that's been really fascinating for a lot of people, because now you get like, oh, here's this like famous scientist guy who's researched a bunch of interesting stuff, and we get to just like hear people pick his brain or listen to him expound on a bunch of details that like, oh, he didn't have this in his book. Like, when would you ever get this information other than on a podcast, you know?
Yeah.
And I think you're right that a lot of people do listen to podcasts, even sometimes in replacement of books, especially for folks who maybe don't want to sit down and read a book for like 10 hours. Oh, well, I'll just listen to the author give a synopsis of his book for 1 hour. And there, I got the gist of it, you know?
Yeah.
I was actually, as I was flying on the planes from Belize, I was thinking about podcasts because I was listening to them quite a bit. And I was thinking about the comparison between listening to a podcast and reading a book or listening to an audiobook. Mm-hmm. And I realized one very interesting thing that you get from a podcast that you really don't get from a book, and that's the conversation.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, assumably people could be podcasting and doing a monologue, and that's interesting too, having monologue podcasts. But a lot of podcasting today is usually between two people, and it's a lot of interview shows and things like that. And so it's like you could pick up somebody's book and you could read the book, which is interesting, or you could listen to them talk about their book in the context of a conversation where somebody's asking questions, and you get a different spin on the book, because you might have somebody who read a chapter, understood the chapter like you, but then they looked at the chapter and was like, well, this weird thing didn't make sense, or you talked about this thing, but I didn't quite understand what you meant, or whatever it is. And now they're discussing something, and you don't really get that just from reading a book, you know? So I think podcasting goes a little bit beyond just the typical information, which makes it really, really fun. So, yeah.
It is interesting too, because you think about it and it's like, if you were to have a conversation, or like books are almost an unnatural way of communicating with somebody in a sense, you know, it's like, it's this kind of dictation to nobody, you know, that people are expected to connect with. Whereas in every other part of their life is all done with conversation and words, like spoken dialogue. You know, it's like if you tried to speak a book to somebody, they would just like write you off as like a weird person. You know, if you tried to speak book to somebody.
You've been monologuing for 10 hours now.
Yeah, which makes sense. Like for maybe for a very deep dive on a topic, or if you're trying to, you know, maybe. I don't know. Yeah. Like maybe in the context of a story, you know, and like you're telling a story and everyone's kind of listening to you. I could see in that context where that makes sense. But for just like light information, or I think especially like opinions, like books that are like, I don't know, just sharing opinions seems like much better in the context of a conversation than in the context of a book, for me at least. And so that's where like podcasts really shine, is on like where people are giving opinions and things that aren't necessarily as like defined. Because I think so much of the time people are trying to kind of work out things for themselves as well. And the best way to do that is usually through conversation, to like work out just things about life. You know, how do I live my life? What's the best way to do something? You know, what's a good opinion to have on this topic? You know, it's like a lot of that stuff's messy and isn't just like, you know, apparently obvious. So hearing the conversation really draws out a lot of those like messy details, more so than just listening to one person's, you know, 5-hour opinion on, you know, what the perfect amount of hours to work in a week is, for instance.
Yeah.
And so you get like, and then having that conversation, you're just automatically throwing in more opinions than just one, which is always, I think, helpful to hear more voices in those areas. So yeah, this question was really just to validate our podcast, validate our existence.
That's right. Yeah, we're doing the right thing by podcasting.
Why are podcasts essential to your daily life? Find out.
Yeah, if you're listening to this, yes, you need this podcast. This podcast is good for you. Listen more. Join our cult.
One other interesting thought I had too with that was, so Because I'm trying to think of like if there's a maximum amount of like time someone should record their life or whatever, or their thoughts. But I was kind of thinking in the context of like people can almost record as much as they want. I think it's more up to like the viewer to really pick and choose like how much they want to engage with like one person, because that's like there's this idea that you have to like watch everything someone puts out or whatever, but I don't think that's like the case necessarily. It could be like I would rather someone put out more and then I get to be like more selective with what I watch from that person, and then so I don't think there's ever like, because there's always, I mean, I've heard the idea that like there could be too much of something, too much podcasting going on in the world, and it's like there's just too many podcasts or whatever. But I think that's more like a problem of selection, as far as like people being able to like actually pick out from maybe that person's content what they want and whatnot. But I don't know. Do you think someone could put out like too much for the consumer, or like if they're assuming they're okay with the amount they're putting out? Is there like a limit to too much someone can produce?
Well, first of all, just because I have to tout the party line here, there could never be too much of our podcast, Paul. Every single thing that we do is perfect and high quality. Obviously, the listeners just love. Yeah, they just want more.
Are we recording 5 days next week still?
Yeah. Yeah, our next podcast is going to be like 12 hours long. No, well, I mean, I think that it comes down to how well things are organized, because in our day and era where we have titles to our podcast and there's a theme that runs throughout the entire show, and people can, scrub the little scroll bar and skip ahead and back, and you can just type in a search of like, I want to listen to somebody talk about Mayan civilizations. Oh, here's all the like 10 podcast episodes that talk about that. Like, I don't think you can have too much, because in our era where we have good organization, if we had a show where it's like you have to listen to this front to back, there's no skipping around, there are no titles that you can search, you have to like listen to episode 1, 2, 3. If you want to get to episode 10, you have to listen to like the 9 before.
Yeah, that was kind of the mistake I made at the beginning. I think I was titling them like episode 1 or episode 2. I'm like, wait a second, that's not good. Like even for me looking back, I'm like, which one was that again? So yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's, like, I think if we weren't as organized as we are today, then having all of this content would be really cumbersome for a lot of people. But, for me, like, there's podcasters out there who've created tons of content, and I don't consume even like 10% of their content. I really like them, but I just cherry pick. I just go to their podcast thing, and it's like, oh, here's like the 5 episodes that talk about the one thing that I'm kind of interested in right now. I'm going to just download those, listen to those things when I have time. Cool. I really like that guy. I like his podcast. And I think that's how a lot of people approach it. And I think that that's good, because it's like you get the great information, the interesting conversation, the interesting story to hear from. You learn a little bit more about a certain person you were following, whatever it is, in a very selected form. You don't have to get all of it. You can get just what you want of it. And I think that's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think the organization, like you said, is a big factor in kind of making it accessible. I always felt like back in the day, I used to have to, I don't know if it was like some weird misplaced loyalty or something, but I always felt like if I was into like a creator, I had to like watch their stuff, like all their stuff. And it was maybe because there was just less content creators out there that I actually enjoyed, so it wasn't as much of a choice. But now there's so many options for like high quality stuff that you can really pick and choose. And yeah, like the same thing, I probably watch 10 to 15% of the stuff that from people I like. So it is kind of cool to have that. And honestly, if you're somebody that like produces less now, that almost makes you stand out in some way, where it's like, ooh, it's the one time a month my favorite YouTuber posted, like I gotta go watch that. So you kind of get this like almost excitement where you wouldn't get with someone who posts 5 times a day or 5 times a week or something. So
well, and that's another thing too, because you can create a library of content that may not even become popular until like years later, when people go back and want to listen to something that you made 5 years ago or whatever. It used to be that if you had like a radio show or a TV show, if you were not there listening and watching to it live when it was being recorded, you missed it. There was no archive to go back to. But now it's like you can make whatever you want, post it whenever you want, and then like 5 years later, yo, this person is really interesting. Let's go back and listen to all their old stuff, you know?
Yeah.
So I think that's another good thing about it too.
I do have a question about that. Do you think, so I know for me, there's like definitely a bias towards older content, like against it for me. I just feel like the world changes so fast that like even a year or two is enough for like some information to change or like viewpoints to change or, you know, information that's, you know, outdated or new information is like, you know, missing or whatnot. So do you feel like that impacts anything? Like when you're like, is there a certain type of content that you wouldn't like go back and look 5 years ago or like, cause for me, it's almost everything. Like if I'm looking up a tutorial for Photoshop, it's like, oh yeah, we're using version 1.6, you know, and it's like on 5 now. Or, you know, if it's content about politics 5 years ago, it's like, oh boy, that Obama, you know, or whatever. Or I guess it was Trump at that point, but, yeah. So, you know, it's like, I don't know. Is there content that you feel like is more timeless?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I think that if somebody's like telling their story, that's timeless. If you had somebody giving kind of their own little memoir or something, you know, there's certain principles of life. If somebody was talking about like theology or the law of morality or something like that, that's very timeless. You could listen to somebody from any era discuss it, and it'd probably be interesting and relevant. Yeah. But yeah, anything that's a news event, eventually everyone's going to know what that thing was, and nobody's really going to care. You know, like right now, there was like a spy Chinese air balloon flying over America. It's the hot topic. Everybody's talking about it. In like 2 months from now, there'll be a new thing. You know, nobody wants to go back and do the Chinese spy thing because we all know about that already. So
yeah,
you know,
and it had already been happening for 15 years prior. Spoiler alert. Yeah. Well, the interesting thing with is you brought up like the morality thing or whatever. Because what always interests, or like another reason I would, I guess, discriminate against older content is that the person, you know, talking about that, like they're going to evolve as a person too, and they're going to become hopefully more mature, more wise as they get older. So it's like, I feel like in some sense, like if you look back at someone's content from earlier, they're like less informed, they have less wisdom and less, just I guess wisdom is probably the right word to like explain that topic. So for me, there's even a little bit of a bias there where it's like, yeah, the fundamental thing might be true, but you know, either the way they communicate it or the way that they speak with more nuance is kind of missing. So like that's
true.
So yeah, I don't know. Like it's a weird thing where, you know, I mean, since we do live in such an instant access world, it is kind of like there's almost no downside for living in the present. So as far as timeless stuff, I don't know. I don't feel like there is that much, honestly. I always look for the newer stuff just because, again, I see the world as kind of always evolving. So to me, like the most interesting stuff is the things in the present or like that are currently happening. And I don't know if this is like relevant at all, but you know, all the monks tell you to stay present, and you know, the past and the future are suffering and all this kind of stuff. So like maybe there is something to like, you know, like the present having like more value. I don't know. That's a total tangent, but that might be my inspiring thing next week.
I mean, when you think about the present in terms of content creators, like these are the people in the present moment who are with you in life, you know, even something that was like 5 years ago, maybe that person who created it is still alive, but they're not 5 years ago. They weren't speaking about our present moment. You know, they weren't like
Yeah.
with us where we are here. So whatever they were talking about, it's like, oh, that's not our current existence. You know,
Well, they're probably a different
They were
person by
thinking
now.
different. They're a different person. 5 years later, different person for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's when good.
Oh, I was going to change the topic a little bit. So finish your thing.
No. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So like, I mean, that's even, you know, in that sense, especially if it is a conversational thing and like you're really trying to get to know somebody through a podcast or something like that. It's like, if it's 5 years ago, you're not even really getting to know them, you know, and even if it's in a weird parasocial way, because they're a different person now. So yeah, let's hear what you.
Well, do you think that our podcast will age well? Like, how long is our podcast going to last? Do you feel like it's just if people don't catch it now, they missed out on the good stuff?
I think it'll be interesting for people that like actually know us, maybe, to like, or even for ourselves. That's what I'm actually most excited for, is just myself. Like, I'll probably be the only one watching in 10 years, and I'll go back and be like, oh man, we did a thing. Like, that was so much fun. And then like have a recording of it. So I guess for nostalgia's sake, and that's, I guess, even YouTube, like if I was to watch a video from a long time ago, I'd be like, oh man, that was when they were using the old thumbnails, or, you know, like this is before everyone realized they should write a script for their videos, or, you know, whatever. Or I'm sure in 10 years time, it'll be like, oh man, they weren't even using AI to like edit their videos or like, you know, do whatever it is for their, you know, thing. It's like, oh man, real people were making videos. That's crazy.
Back when they had to speak into microphones and it didn't just come out of their mind. No way.
Yeah. So, you know, in 10 years, that might be a thing. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think ours will necessarily offer a ton of insight, except to like people with nostalgia or maybe internet historians. You're like, what was on the mind of the 2022 person?
These two bimbos on here really iconify the entire human race at this era.
They're really into maps in 2023. That's weird.
Yeah. I mean, it is like, even if nobody else listens to this, you know, okay, just setting down the time capsule for 5 years from now. It's like, if nobody else listens to this except our future selves going back and being like, look at the fun thing that we created together out of our friendship. Like, that's cool. Or future kids or family members or friends. I mean, to me, that's totally worth it. You know, even if, you know, I'm sure that there's people listening who have like just stumbled across us randomly. We're glad you're here. Whoever you are, you know who you are. People who don't know us in person. And
that'd be weird.
And that's cool, you know, but it's like, maybe if it never reaches the unknown humanity, if it's only the people that we like have interacted with personally, and even just to ourselves, then it's like a really cool thing to do in and of itself, just because we get to look back on it, almost like journaling. It's like weird friendship journaling, where we can look back and be like, oh man, can't believe that we used to think that way. That was stupid, or whatever.
And everything's like, you know, dated and time stamped to when it was, so you could be like, well, when did I go to Belize? And then you go look at the video, and it's like, oh yeah, it was in February. That's cool. So like a little time capsule.
Think about interesting people from history. You know, George Washington. Like, what if George Washington just happened to have like 100 hours of recorded podcasts? It's like, that would be
people would lose their minds.
Be super cool. Yeah, people would lose their minds. It's like,
or they would cancel him instantly.
Yeah,
like, he was a little racist.
He was way worse than we thought. Oh, that's terrible. You know, I mean,
It's
like like right now in history, he's a little bit of this mythology. Like, we don't know all the details about his mannerisms and what he we kind of know what he looked like, and there's some pictures and artists and some different things, and it's like, okay, that's cool. But it's like, in 300 years from now, almost every human being has tons of their life as content online. And it's very easy to like research people and get to know who people are. You don't have these like mysterious figures of history anymore. Hundreds of years from now, there is no mystery. We kind of know everything about everybody.
Yeah. I mean, that's even like happening in weird ways. Like I keep like all the sitcoms or whatever, like Krista and I watch, it'll be like, it'll be like, I don't know which was one, Parks and Rec or whatever, where like Donald Trump like walks through in like one of the scenes.
Oh, does he? Oh,
is it?
I forgot about
Parks
that.
and Rec.
He walks through. He's in a few different movies. He walks
or
through
Home Alone,
like,
I think
Home
it was,
Alone.
or something.
Yeah, Home Alone. He's in like a little scene. Yeah,
yeah. Or like I guess in The Office, like there's one of his books that like Michael picks up or something. But you know, it's like you see like even these like little cross cultural references of these people in like all different forms of media too. You know, so it's like they're not even just like you have access to them. You know, not only the words they're saying, but like people are also like other media is also mentioning these people too. You know, it's like you know, I'm sure we've mentioned Joe Rogan. It's like, well, there you go. You know, you just by connection, like, you know, if like an anthropologist was to like look at our stuff, they'd be like, oh, who's this Joe Rogan guy? You know, obviously it's going to be not the case, but
yeah, he's got more of a record than we do. But it is interesting because if you think about, you know, just coming from that historical, archaeological, Christian background, looking at, you know, oh, where's the evidence that Jesus was real? Like this other historian, like mentioned the name of Jesus in one of his writings. That tiny little like blip of a mention, and we like, ooh, we put a lot of weight on that, you know?
Yeah.
And it's funny.
Usually those like the weight goes up by the number of like blips they find, you know, from different sources or like sources.
Right. And it's just crazy how stuff in like ancient history, you're really reading into these tiny little details and putting a ton of weight on those little details, where at the time it might have just been a casual conversation kind of thing, you know, just like, oh yeah, I was down in Galilee and there was this like Jesus
my
guy
cousin
talking.
Jesus was
out fishing. I don't know, whatever.
Oh yeah.
And there's stuff that today we could say in casual conversation, even things about our culture, you know, like, oh, they you know, used to like drive cars that weren't self-driving. Oh, that's
everyone worshipped Elon, some guy named Elon Musk.
Everybody
he was their god.
The Musk cult.
Yeah. Who was this? His religious figure, Elon Musk. People thought he was going to take them to the afterlife on Mars.
he took them through the 13 levels of heaven.
Yeah, it's like you get
true heaven, which was Mars.
It's like you kind of get some of the details and then make up the rest, and it turns into this weird thing.
Yeah. Apparently, yeah, people believed in a strange cult thing. Yeah. I don't know. Instead of sacrificing, you know, living creatures, they sacrificed their brains. Yeah. No.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that is it. Yeah, like the cross reference of like different mentions of things is going to be really interesting. Especially if you could do like, you know, people will do word cloud stuff in the future where it's like, you know, you're scouring the internet and it's like, how many times was, you know, I mean, they already do that, you know, I think during like elections and stuff, don't they do that where it's like, how many times is like a certain candidate's name mentioned in the news or like stuff like that?
Oh, yeah.
I feel like I've seen that somewhere. Maybe it was for the Olympics or something. I don't know. But
that would be an interesting thing if we took all of our podcast episodes, transcribed them, and then what words were our most used words, like a little analysis of our word stuff.
Yeah,
that would be interesting.
And you'll be able to like in the near future. I mean, I'm sure you already can, but it'll just become easier to kind of like scrape. You know, I mean, they're already doing it with the AI stuff where they're scraping all the data from the web, you know, and like aggregating it. But like, I'm sure you'll be able to aggregate like video data as well and just kind of like see how much stuff's mentioned. And I'm sure advertisers are already doing that to some extent to try to figure out what people are they're buzzing about.
I'm sure advertisers and the CIA. I don't know who's more technologically advanced in terms of surveillance, marketing, advertising people, or the secret services of our country.
I would honestly put my money on advertisers. A whole different breed of people. When there's money involved, no one's going to leave a dime on the table.
When it comes to national security, that's important. When it comes to the more surveillance I do, the more money I make. You have a whole level of competition there.
Yeah. That was, oh, geez. That could be a whole nother tangent.
That's a whole long rabbit hole.
We'll probably wrap it up there then.
Yeah, we should. Yeah, so podcasting. There we go. That's what we were talking about.
Yep. What a time to be alive. Everyone should have their own podcast all the time.
That's right. But you should mostly listen to ours.
Yeah, make hundreds of hours of content, and then we'll only watch 5 minutes of it.
That's right.
All right. Cool. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.